Welcome everybody to our last webinar of the year. I am Dr. Samantha Pearman-Kanza and I am joined today by the esteemed Professor Stuart Chalk. Before I hand over to Stuart, I'm just going to give a brief introduction. Stuart is a professor in the chemistry department at the University of North Florida, and his research is focused on the areas of chemical informatics and data science. But today he's going to talk about his latest project, KnowLedger, which has been funded by the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
And thank you to PSDI for inviting me to come into Southampton and do this webinar today. As Sammy said, this is an US NSF funded project, and it is the second one I've had, but thinking about it relative to the first one that I had, I think personally this is a bit more important, and hopefully you'll see why as I go through this. And so what I'm going to talk about is a grant that I haven't even started yet. Officially, the grant for KnowLedger does not start until January 1 of 25. But the reason why I'm doing a presentation on this right now is because it's only a 2-year grant. And even though that sounds like a long time in general sense, that's really not a long time, especially because of what this grant is about. As you will see, this is very much about getting the scientific community to buy in on an idea for a product that can help with research data management. So some introductory slides to kind of set the scene a little bit before we get into actually what the grant is about. So in a general sense, I think many of us probably really understand what the problem is in research these days. There's the traditional paradigm of how we do research. It's been with us for a long time, and in some ways it's not really serving us well relative to where things are going, especially in the arena of digital data and digital processing of data. There's too much data. Many researchers are even struggling to keep track of their own data, let alone look at, find related data to the research that they're doing that may be available online. There's not enough time to keep track of the research, but also keep track of the literature, to keep track of data that's available. So these all are sort of major overriding factors that are influencing how scientists are doing their research. And a tangential but very important thing that's happening as well is, in most cases, research data management skills are not where they really need to be, whether that's just because of bad habits that they've been able to get into, or it's because they didn't get quite the right education along the way to be able to kind of understand what they need to do from a due diligence standpoint when they collect their research data. So we need to find a way to try and move the needle on this and get researchers out of a rut that they're in this sort of situation. So given that, what's a solution? Well, obviously there are potentially many solutions, but one of my perspective on this is we need something that's free, open source, as a data management solution that enables researchers to do their research. And I'm kind of emphasizing that word because in a sense, there are lots of pieces of software that we use on a regular basis that we don't realize, but they are enabling us to do that much more efficiently than maybe other ways that traditionally we might have done them. And so I think there's an opportunity here to build something that will sort of encourage researchers to come into a system for many different reasons, as I will hopefully try and highlight here. Now, the purview of a solution could theoretically be to make it something that is available to many different types of researchers. And if you're going to do that, then you have to make it modular, with the idea that no two researcher is really the same. Of course, we might hope that in a particular discipline that the approaches to research are very similar. But again, how each individual researcher does their research is very much their way of doing things. And so we need to be able to find something or create something that will fit the needs of each individual researcher. To do that, we would need to have a modular approach to how the software was set up, because again, a chemist like myself is different than a biologist, than a computer scientist, than an astronomer, than any other kind of scientist doing research. And so we have to be able to support a whole variety of different tools, resources, access to data, the research literature, all kinds of different things, even things that at this point I haven't even thought about in terms of what might need to be included with this. So we've got to do it in a way that allows us to collaborate, because collaboration is becoming, if not have been, but is becoming even more important. And I mean collaboration in terms of a research group that's local at a university or in a company, but also obviously external collaborations where you have different groups that have specialties in certain areas, and collaboration is very important. One thing that I'll reiterate on other slides here is we need to think about having something that can help us implement what we say we're going to do from a data management plan perspective. Data management plans have become a big thing recently, and they are, in a sense, sort of like, it's almost like the chicken and the egg. You kind of have to set up your data management plan in anticipation of what you think you're going to do with the data that you collect, but in most cases, it doesn't really work out that way, but at least you should be taking the ideas behind the data management plan in terms of how you do your research. So maybe there's a way we can actually do something more with a data management plan. And then maybe most importantly, provide some kind of interface so that not only researchers can see the data that they have and manage it, but also that they have what they feel is control of that data. And by that, I really mean encouraging them to share their data where they can, but obviously having an interface that shows what data they are sharing, what data they're not sharing, and maybe even being able to put embargoes on data and sort of automatically release them after a certain period of time per some funding requirement or so on. So, in a sense, we're talking about something that can help the researcher not just do the research, but also all of the other pieces that are necessary in today's environment to do research. We have to create something that researchers want to use and are invested in. Now, this is a technology problem, but in a general sense, I think the technology is not the bigger problem. I think the biggest problem is people. In a sense, this is really about trying to change the perspectives of researchers about how they collect their data from the research that they do. And that is a sociological challenge that many people have tried to address over the years. From a chemistry perspective, of course, we originally LIMS systems were the thing, but of course they're still around, but they're not necessarily quite what we need. And so we have to come up with something that's really going to help the scientist at the bench and change the way they think about how they do their science. With all of that said, there are current drivers that really lead us to this idea. And this is a lot of the stuff that I was thinking about when I wrote the proposal for KnowLedger. Researchers, in many ways, are wasting their time because in certain situations, they're repeating research that's already been done. In a sense, it would be great if, obviously, there were a way to know if a particular set of research experiments had been done, was found, obviously, not to be useful. There was nothing they could get out of that information. So that means other researchers wouldn't have to repeat that. To go along with the data management plan side of things, funders are requiring data management plans and, of course, are also open and requiring that research is done is published in open publications. We have the technical infrastructure to support most types of research, so that's not a barrier. And I look at it as a driver because that basically means we can think about creating interesting solutions to being able to do this kind of stuff. There are many reports about reproducibility in science and how it needs to be improved. And so if we can get to the point where there is maybe a more standardized way to represent workflows that not only students within a group can do basically the same way, obviously sharing that across different research groups would also be much more useful. Collaboration across disciplinary boundaries is becoming important these days. It's not enough just to be in one silo. You really sort of have to almost be on the edge of chemistry and informatics, or chemistry and biology, or other interdisciplinary areas. You may or may not know that there's this thing called FAIR out there. That is a paradigm shift in terms of thinking about how we deal with our data and put it out into the community, making it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I think institutions are starting to understand the importance of data. And so as a consequence, there are actually more resources being pushed in that direction. Maybe not quickly enough, but still resources being targeted at the institutional level to help researchers with their data. And finally, if we're going to start really doing data integration at a larger scale to support AI and ML and other areas, reuse of data and therefore being able to get access to data is a hugely important thing. So, I'm trying to make the case that there are lots of different things going on right now that are really important, that I think can help us push us over the edge of this sort of move to something different than the traditional paradigm. So the KnowLedger grant is, as I said, a US NSF funded project. It was actually put in under their EAGER program, which is basically a program that is a high risk, high reward, 2-year time frame, which basically means we have to show as much success in the grant as we can within 2 years, because we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, because it is high risk, high reward. We're going to talk about a research notebook, but in a sense, that might also be a moniker that isn't useful in this context, because in a sense, this could be whatever different scientists call it that they collect their research in. It is what they use, or hopefully will be what they use, and become a digital Swiss Army knife, as I put in here, to sort of help them manage the whole process of doing research, not necessarily just the data acquisition. So there are lots of features and functionalities we could build into this. And this is where it starts becoming sort of an idea that gets very big, because if we think about the idea this can be used by multiple different types of researcher, then that obviously extends the gamut of the kinds of things that researchers will want to do with this. And so what we've got on here is a few examples of the obvious kinds of things that we would want to have in here: secure data management, versioning, authentication to obviously that data, and then finally mechanisms to publish that data, whether that be as supplemental data to a research paper or just as an open data set. But we also have to have a way of storing that data. And I'm proposing to use something that I've worked on previously, which is called SciData. I'll give you an example of this coming up. But in a general sense, we need to have the data stored in a way that is relatively sort of technology agnostic. And so the idea is to use JSON LD, which is the JSON specification for linked data. And while this is an encoding of the resource description framework, meaning it's a semantic data representation format, this project is not specifically focusing on that as an activity. And the reason for that, as much as interesting as it is simply because it would make the scope a bit too broad, I think, certainly for a 2-year time frame. So more about that later on. So we need to have ways to define lots of different resources and pieces of the infrastructure that researchers use. We have to have ways for researchers to interact. We have to have ways for researchers to be able to get information from all the sources that they currently get information, but maybe we can do that in one interface that makes it much easier, not only for the researcher to actually do that, but also for the system to keep track of what that researcher has done in terms of going out to a particular website and getting some data that is useful for their research. Because one of the key things that is really lost today is provenance around where you get data. And again, from a reuse of data perspective, that's a feature, that's a mindset that I think a lot of people need to get into, because it's really important from the perspective of moving this forward. Looking at this system as a way to manage the research workflow. Now, the first iteration of this grant, we don't have time to be able to do, for instance, a version that might be considered at a sort of a PI level, where a research faculty member is able to look over like all of their students using this software to be able to see, the productivity of each student, where they are, be able to communicate with them, manage the group in a sense through the interface. So this is initially just going to be targeted at individual researchers, but down the road, it certainly could be scaled to that higher level. And obviously, we hope to get there later on. Again, technical and sociological challenges. But the key thing, and what is maybe the strangest thing about this grant, is there are only 2 people funded to work on this grant, yet we need to get as many people involved in this project as possible. And so the way that we've set up the grant and what we anticipate happening is all about getting community involvement. Because if we don't get researchers interested in this and then providing feedback as to what they want in such an interface, we're not going to get anywhere with this. So to start off with, there's an idea for a Python-based piece of software that is going to be basically relatively generic in the sense that it itself will not have a lot of the tools and the access to things that individuals would like in the interface. This is going to be the software that kind of coordinates everything. We're going to, again, use JSON-LD for storing the data that has to be within the software to kind of actually activate it. And then the research data, which is a separate piece, is going to also be stored in JSON-LD, but that's using this SciData framework that I've mentioned and is coming up on a slide or two. We're going to have the postdoc on the grant develop the software, but we are obviously going to invite the community to get interested members come in as developers, co-developers, to help us make this as rugged a piece of software, as agile from a development perspective piece of software, so that it can support all the needs that the research community would have in terms of the tooling underneath that they would want to put in it. And the idea is that the first version of this as a beta will be out in Q3 of next year, and it will be made available as a Docker image. And the idea there is that means it makes it very much easier for us to have individual researchers download that to their computer and run it on their computer, no matter what the operating system is. Basically, all of the code resources that are necessary for KnowLedger will be within the Docker image, and all that the user needs to do is download Docker and then download the image and start running it. Now, what is it going to look like? Well, this is not what it's going to look like. This is a very crude, obviously, representation of an interface. But the point is really not that it's going to look like this, but that it's going to have components in it that are designed for and used by the individual researchers. So they get to define what this interface looks like, from where on the screen things are, as to what resources are available, what stuff they turn off, what stuff they prioritize. Obviously, we're going to make this from a functionality UI interface perspective as robust as we can, so that it can support as many different views of how research is done as possible. And how would we set this up? Well, again, we've said we are going to develop the basic KnowLedger software, so that's not going to have the functionality of it built in. So that functionality needs to be provided from some other place, and that is going to be through a set of GitHub repositories that we will use as part of the project. So on the left-hand side of this diagram, I have some orange octagons, and those are sort of the technical stuff from the development of KnowLedger, the software side. And that's all about the actual development of the code. It's some data governance and code governance that I think we need to build out to make sure that's appropriately done. The data infrastructure, the general data infrastructure underneath KnowLedger, the SciData part of it for the research data, all of that stuff is going to be on closed repositories, but obviously inviting the community to contribute as they can. And one of the things we really hope is that we find enthusiasts for this idea that will be willing to develop, to contribute some of their time to help us with this, because we probably can't do everything. On the right-hand side, the gray octagons are GitHub repositories where individual aspects of what's needed for KnowLedger, sort of under the hood, are going to be developed by the community. The idea is each one of these GitHub repositories will basically be centered around a particular topic, and we hope that there are going to be champions from within the community that are agreed to sort of head each one of those up, with guidance from a steering committee that we put together. And then ongoing, there's going to be discussions in each of these GitHub repositories, and obviously we anticipate Zoom calls and stuff to have people actually get together and work on whatever specification is necessary, whatever aspect is being worked on within that GitHub repository. And the idea is that over time, there is going to be some specification developed, and that specification either is sort of an inherent part of what comes in under the hood under KnowLedger, or it's a templating development that then means you can build certain things in accordance to that template. A good example of this, which I will show you a very kind of rudimentary version of later on, is about module development, meaning how do all those individual little modules in the interface, how do they get created? How do we define that they do a specific thing? So the community repositories are going to be sort of the major part of this project, in the sense of we need a lot of input from different members of many different communities to weigh in on how to set up the data for a particular part of the project, but then also follow through with maybe instances of that. So writing up examples showing how it actually works when they start playing with the beta version. So I mentioned this idea of using something called SciData as the way to store the data. And just quickly to show you what that looks like, it's basically a representation of, or an organization of data in JSON LD that allows you to, from a semantic perspective, apply meaning to the data elements that are present. Again, in this project, we're not specifically focusing on the semantic side. We're trying to just get things up and running. But later on, we do obviously hope that we can work on that perspective. And I know this is a little bit small on the slides, but the main key point of this is that SciData has 3 separate sections where you can store information. One is the actual data set area, and that can be an individual data point, a spectrum, or a whole big corpus of data. But more importantly are these pieces called aspects and facets. They are generic places within the specification where basically the framework of SciData does not define what information goes in those places. That information is specific to the metadata about the research data that is being stored in the file. So it can be represented any way that's appropriate, however many metadata fields that are necessary to describe it, set up in whichever way is best for that particular type of data. And so basically, this generic structure can support the representation of both research data and the metadata describing the context of that research data, which is why it's useful. Okay, so I know this is a busy slide, but this is sort of something from the actual proposal to try and show what different aspects the community might work on. Logging, for instance, of activity. So it's a great thing that we can end up, hopefully, being able to track sort of how researchers do their research. And so I think there's a very interesting perspective here about eventually, if this takes off, we could have a way to look at how researchers do their research process and maybe see where there are issues with that. One is on data governance. How do we make sure we appropriately look after the data? User profiles, module development, I mentioned, is going to be very important because that really dictates the interface elements that will be available. Collaboration, we need to have ways that people can collaborate, because these days that's just something that is sort of fundamental, I think, to doing research. I think we can also have a perspective of using the software as a way to do education, because we can maybe put certain specific tooling in to be able to help either replay research as it's done, or at least show off how research should be done in terms of a sequence of events. We need to obviously invest in community engagement, because that's a huge part of this project. So in addition to seeking input from the community, we're also going to be trying to sort of seed from KnowLedger out to the community in terms of, hey, we're doing this research in this way. Is this good? Do you like this? Would you like it differently? If you would, go and help us. You know, we need to kind of do a show and tell on a constant basis if we can. An accessibility component is obviously very important. And then maybe you might look at this as miscellaneous, but I look at this as very important. We need to come up with, well, what are all the resources that are out there? Because obviously in any research community, there's lots of different places that people use on the web. There's lots of different pieces of software. There's different data sets out there. There's different specifications, let alone different data formats. So we sort of need to gather that information so we can know the scope of those things. And then as necessary, the different communities in the ecosystem can then sort of all know about those activities or tools, and obviously take advantage of them where they can. Because again, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. If there's something out there that we can reuse in the context of this, we absolutely should. So just a quick sort of description how I think about each one of these individual GitHub repositories working. You know, we need, like I said, to get a champion for a particular piece of it. We need to obviously then create a community of people that are willing to be major collaborators on this. And so they would end up in the GitHub sense being a collaborator. That means they can edit documents and obviously do other admin functions. But then in addition to that, one of the nice features of GitHub is that you can fork a repository. If you're a GitHub user, you can take a complete copy of the repository. So you can actually not only take a copy of, okay, the documentation, which maybe isn't so interesting, but you could also take a copy of whatever the specification was that had been developed in this particular repository, and even create your own instance of something that's in line with that, because you're kind of using what's available in the fork as the template for how you would build something. And then if you build something, you can then push that back to the main repository by doing what's called a pull request. And so in a sense, we're trying to have different levels of community engagement, but make it accessible to everybody, so that anybody that wants to be sort of part of this project can do so at whatever level they feel comfortable. Anyone at all, don't have to have a GitHub username, can post an issue on any of the repositories, and of course they can therefore provide their own feedback basically anonymously if they wish to. And part of that will also be turned around to discussions. You know, if we get lots of issues on a repository, then we can open up the discussions feature that's in a GitHub repository and start actual conversations with the community about particular very important, if they've risen to the top level topics. Documentation on each of these sites will be provided by the wiki functionality, and you know, I think the tooling that is available in GitHub seems very sort of useful and appropriate in the context of trying to do this. So we're going to take full advantage of it as much as we can. So here's a very, very quick example, because what I've talked about is sort of very high level and in some ways a little bit ethereal and not quite so, you can't easily see it because we don't have anything yet. But let me just go through this little example that I've put together this week. Basically, the idea being that on the right-hand side here, we have a JSON file that describes some nominal metadata elements that describe a module. And again, this is nowhere near complete as to what we would end up getting, but this is the idea that the repository for modules, NOMO, would end up creating a specification for how generically modules would be categorized and defined that would then be able to feed into the KnowLedger software. Once we have that, then that translates into a template for how somebody can put together, these fields of information. And so those fields of information would then be translated into code, which is shown in the center here. And I'm not suggesting by saying translated into code that necessarily there's going to be code in the instances of the template, because then you can run into problems with security and code injection and all that kind of stuff. But we need to find a way where we can sort of allow a definition of functionality, but then implement that in code in the KnowLedger software. And so that's going to be a major piece of the development of the KnowLedger software itself. And then as we've now defined some code which develops us a module, then the module can get put into the interface. And so this little example is just providing search access to the Crossref API, which is where you can get metadata for any publication that has a DOI. And the idea here is that the search functionality that's in this box, first of all, pings the API to find resources that fit that particular term, but then you can have the option to save one or more of what comes back into the local database that is being used underneath KnowLedger. And so this is sort of exactly the same thing as we do in terms of research literature, right? But it would be right in the interface. And again, this example is very, very minimal in comparison to what we would want to do, because we want to have a lot of functionality to dictate more than maybe just one metadata field. But if I play this little video, you'll get a sense of this. Now, this is built underneath is in Django, but the interface, which is something we're still not completely set with in terms of exactly what we're going to use, is in this case Django Unicorn, which is basically it's not a JavaScript in the browser, but it's a JavaScript behind the hood kind of tool. And so what we've done here is this is an interface element where this information has just automatically come in the page when we've done the search. And then when we clicked add here, it's automatically added that particular paper to the database that's in the local instance of KnowLedger. So the idea is this module allows that functionality to occur. And of course, we could build something like this, or at least a module like this, which was generic, maybe across different reference resources. Of course, there are quite a number out there. So this is kind of the idea of how KnowLedger will work. We need community groups to get together and help develop out the specifications for how we can define these different elements of the KnowLedger system. Okay, so wrapping up here, what I need is for as many people from the community to be involved in this project. And here are some ideas about how you can get involved. First of all, we need you to think about what would you like to have in such a sort of utopian piece of software, and give us those ideas. There's already a repository ready for you to submit your ideas. You just have to submit a GitHub issue to this particular repository, which is about collecting people's ideas about what they would need in the KnowLedger interface. Obviously, take part in one of these ecosystem repositories, whatever you find most interesting. Put your energy that you can spare into that particular activity. Obviously, when we put out the software, download it and try it out. Please promote this project to your community. Again, this is nominally something that we're hoping many researchers across different communities can use. So we don't know all those communities. We don't know all the places where researchers in a community go to or are interacting with. So we need to spread the word. Give presentations about this project. We don't have stock slide decks yet, but we will. So you'll be able to download those and use those to give a presentation. We'd love to know when and where you do that so that we can put that in our information and keep track of all the presentations that are done. Write a letter of support for this project that we can include in other funding proposals that may come up later. Clearly, if this works as an idea, there are lots of possibilities for future funding opportunities. So, we're thinking ahead here. Now, if you really want to invest in this, dedicate some time, yours or somebody else's, that you admin, don't just volunteer other people, to do something to advance this software in your organization or your research group. And then maybe you can even write your own research grant that sort of spins off of this project. We don't need anything from you other than obviously acknowledging this project and letting us have a quick look at the proposal. So there's many opportunities for people to get involved. If you have questions, here's my contact information. We already have KnowLedger up on GitHub, knowledgerproject.github.io. There's the actual repository there as well, and then a link to the NSF award. Underneath the KnowLedger repository, that's where we will have all of these other the KnowLedger organization on GitHub. We will have all these other repositories that are for the different aspects that need to be worked on. And the postdoc and I on the grant are going to be actively engaging with all those groups. And so who knows if we'll be able to sleep. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer, I'm sure, all of the 15,000 questions there are in the chat. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart, for the wonderful talk. Now let's go to the questions. How is this different to things like OLS or the NFDI for Chem platform, or the plethora of other research data management platforms that are currently in existence, both within thematics, e.g. chemistry, or outside thematics, e.g. GREIs?
I guess I would say that by just saying that it's trying to be obviously not assuming necessarily anything from anywhere. And I mean, that sounds like a cop-out in a sense, but I think there are research motifs that are obviously cross-cutting across the different disciplines. And so I think the idea that there's a generic way that, one, you can have a research data management system, but then two, that you can really customize that to what you feel you need to be efficient and effective and hopefully complete in terms of doing your research. I personally think that's something like this that is necessary. And I have to say, I'm not completely aware of every single, obviously, RDM system, but in a sense, I think the generic nature of this project is an advantage in the sense we're not going to tell the community necessarily what they need. We're going to ask the community to give us what they need.
Did you look at NFDI for Chem before you started?
No, I mean, I'm very aware of the NFDI for Chem work, and actually, it turns out I have been able to convince two of the members of NFDI for Chem to be part of the steering committee for this project. And that's both from the perspective of the ELN side, so Nicole Young is going to be on there, but also from sort of a higher level look across NFDI in a general sense, because obviously there's lots of different consortia in different disciplinary areas. And I think it would be really useful to reach out, and I hope I'll be able to give this presentation to the broader group at NFDI to be able to get, obviously solicit more input and participation in this project.
Your architecture seems tightly coupled, very much JSON LD, but is it actually going to be a bit more around federated digital objects, or are you just going to really build it as a tightly coupled system?
I think the answer to that question at this point is we will defer to what the community thinks is the right approach, because, again, I'm sort of deferring, but I almost want the community to tell us what's the right way to do this, or at least give us their best recommendation about this so that we can try and implement, rather than us tell the community the way we're going to do it. Because, well, in a general sense, I think yourself and obviously a lot of other people have thought about this, have a lot of wisdom in this area, and I can't claim to have that wisdom. So I think it's much better that we get a lot of feedback from the community and they sort of define for us how this is best going to be set up under the hood.
This is quite ambitious. So what do you think you need to get this functional and basic level? And what are the really unique elements that will make this platform stand out?
I think it's definitely the module development, because that obviously plays into, in a sense, the majority of not only the interface, but then the majority of the flexibility that the individual researcher can use. I think one of the things that we're also going to do, though, is once we see how much uptake there is of specific activities within this project, I think we're obviously going to have to do some work to seed some stuff. So we may get in there and do some stuff, and maybe in some fashion be a little bit not argumentative, but try and push the discussion and see why are there not so many people interested in this particular area? Is it because it's not interesting, or is it because it's difficult to do, or is it just because nobody's thought about it before? And so there's definitely a motivation, I think, for us to get in there and try and push activities if there aren't natural, a number of people coming in and actually starting to focus on specific topic areas, because well, there's lots of stuff out there, and we need to really try and somehow convince the community that these things are important, to bring them in and have them make the discussions and then tell us, well, this is really the way things are. And then we can go, well, how can we solve that? Because if we don't start having those discussions, then obviously we're not going to get anywhere with this stuff. So I absolutely think, I very much do not want to be trying to do stuff from a chemistry perspective myself, because I want this to be obviously a disciplinary agnostic effort. I have a lot of ideas, obviously, from a chemistry perspective, but I need to hear these other disciplines and what they need and what they use, and why would this work for them or why would this not work for them. So,
how discipline agnostic are you thinking? So, for example, scientific discipline agnostic, or will this include humanities or social sciences data? And do you think that any of that data will be conducive to the sort of models you've been planning, given how different qualitative data can be from the sort of data you've been thinking about, particularly with the JSON-LD representation?
This is a really good question, because one of the focal points when I was trying to put together a group for the steering committee for this project was I wanted to make sure that the social sciences were included in this. And so we do have Simon Hodson from CoData, who's on the steering committee, and he and Arafan Gregory have been involved in the CDIF specification, which is a social sciences-based kind of broad specification for data. And we've had several discussions through the World Fair project about that particular activity. And I think there seems to be some, at least Simon and Arafan seem to think there's some alignment with CDIF and this idea. So the answer is yes. I mean, while social sciences data is different, it's obviously no less important than other types of data. So I think we need to cover the bases, or try to cover the bases if we can.
How do you think this will fit in with CDIF? And do you have any specific ideas for this?
I actually think there's quite a bit out of CDIF that we can extract out as a sort of an architecture, in a sense. They have some interesting approaches to how to do things, and the specification is in XML, which from one standpoint is a good thing, from another standpoint is, in my mind, a little bit limiting maybe. But I think we can learn a lot from the discussions that they've had, certainly through the World Fair project in particular, and taking that and seeing how much of that we can translate is a very interesting exercise that I want to do. And one of the things that's going to be probably my postdoc's responsibility in the second quarter next year, after we just get things rolling in the first quarter. So,
as a user, how do I use this software once it exists?
For the software itself, the idea is you will download Docker. There will be instructions on the KnowLedger software repository about how to install the software. You will basically go download Docker. You will then be instructed to load in a particular image, which of course is an image of the software. Then there will be some guidance about how to set up the system, meaning obviously basic information about who the user is, what kind of research area they're in, some basic template information. And then it's going to be sort of, at least initially, very much open as to exactly what things they'll be able to implement immediately, because we don't know exactly how much the community is going to be able to develop things far enough to actually integrate stuff into the interface. But again, I think in that situation, we will likely also have some, well, maybe let's say bare bones sort of surrogates for what we will get eventually, so that we can make it functional, let users actually see sort of what the interface looks like and how it's going to be usable, try and give them a sense of the kinds of features that you can expect. And what I hope is that a lot of those that download the initial beta will agree for us to get on calls, so we can actually talk to them about what they need from the interface. Why did they decide to download this and have a look at it? What is it that they can't do with what they already do, and therefore what they need to do that is encouraging them to look at the software?
How do you plan on keeping this modular as development progresses?
So my idea is that if we do get to the point where we have a whole set of modules, those will be basically sort of developed and coordinated and then stored in a repository on GitHub, with the idea that the software obviously knows to go look in that location to be able to pull those particular specifications for different components for the interface. Of course, that will be done in some fashion that initially gets a list. So it's not pulling everything in initially, of course. It's going to have a list, and then the user will say, I want this one. And then there's going to have to be an interface option where it says, okay, where do you want to stick things in the interface? And then they decide to put this one here and that one there. And then once they've configured that, then it will show up like that. So that's the general way in which we think it's going to evolve.
How do you get around the problem of giving users too much choice from the get-go and introducing choice paralysis?
That's a good question, because I would love that we have hundreds of interface elements available to researchers. Assuming we get up to scale, like something where that would be a problem, I think then we would be in a situation where development of disciplinary sort of suggested list of things that a user might put into their interface, and then that could be tied to them picking themselves as a particular user profile from a disciplinary perspective. Now that's a chicken and egg again, though, because people don't necessarily like to be pigeonholed in certain things. So there would also have to be some kind of, here are some other maybe sort of related interface elements that you might be interested in. Or there's going to be a search functionality, for the modules where you say, I'm interested in something to do this, and then it comes up with what the options are. So again, it is a sort of a chicken and an egg thing. We've got to have a lot of people coming together and figuring out that they want these components, and then being willing to kind of define them. And then people will start using them, and hopefully when they start using them, they'll go, oh, this is great, but we need to make it better. And of course, they reinvest in making that module even better. And that's obviously what we're hoping for.
Is there much of a risk of a lack of intercompatibility between settings or templates? For example, if you started working on one set of settings and then wanted to change them 6 months down the line, would this pose problems for the data that you've already introduced?
that's absolutely a potential problem. And so clearly we are anticipating there will be different versions of the templates for certain modules. That, though, needs to be decoupled from how the data is stored and about those particular modules. So I think if we can keep those two separate, that the definition of the functionality and the fields of information that are necessary in the template for a particular module is kept separate than the actual data that's recorded in the system as the user uses that module, then we hopefully will be able to at least mitigate any issues where things won't work anymore. We may have to have some kind of small upgrade scripts that change some go in and change the fields slightly to align them with the new version. But I think that's something that we can handle as long as we keep the definition of the interface element separate than the actual data that is recorded for the user.
So thank you very much, Stuart, and thanks everyone for listening. We wish you all a very happy holidays, and we will be back with more PSDI webinars in the new year. Make sure to keep an eye on the PSDI website and socials for all of our latest updates.